welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and this is the very first Spotlight Saturday. So I mentioned in my first 12 Days of Christmas video some changes that were coming to the channel, and you've probably already noticed that my filming schedule has changed from Tuesday and Thursdays to Tuesday and Saturday. And I said in that video that I had a new series starting called Spotlight Saturday. This isn't going to be every single Saturday, but I do want it to be at least a couple Saturdays a month, I hope. So this is hopefully the first of many. And for today's Spotlight, I wanted to talk about something that I wanted to make a video for the 12 Days of Christmas, but I kind of ran out of days. And that's all the series that I read in 2022. I actually did have some people asking me for this video, and it just didn't make it into the 12 Days of Christmas, so we're doing it now. I'm gonna try to keep descriptions of these series relatively brief because I started 17 series in the year 2022. So for this, I'm not including series that I already had in progress before that year started. It's literally just the series that I started. So some of these are ones that I have talked about semi-recently because they made it into like the best or the worst or my read or read project. So some of these have been mentioned kind of recently. Some of them, it's been a while since I talked about them. But I'm going to talk about each series and whether or not I plan to continue. These are literally like in no particular order. So we're going to start with Gregor the Overlander, which is the first in, I think maybe it's the Underworld series or Chronicles, and it's a middle grade fantasy series by Suzanne Collins, who also wrote The Hunger Games, but she wrote the Gregor series first. I think there are 5 books in this series. It's about a young boy who kind of ends up in this secret underground world underneath his New York City apartments and just kind of his journeys there. And I loved the first book. I was so pleasantly surprised by it. So this is a series that I'll be continuing. The next series that I have on my list is the Gentleman Bastard series by Scott Lynch. I read The Lies of Locke Lamora in the summer, and it kind of kicked off like a whole bunch of adult fantasy reading for me. So you'll see quite a few of the adult fantasy series that I began as a result of being in a fantasy mood thanks to The Lies of Locke Lamora. This is a book that was on my read or read project, and I had really low expectations going in. I kind of picked it up on a whim because I'd heard like 1 or 2 people say good things about it, but then I had a lot of people tell me that they didn't like it or they DNF'd it or whatever. So I had kind of low expectations going in, but I really enjoyed it. It has a really good found family aspect. Feels very like Oliver Twist, but in a fantastical, very kind of grim world. And this is a book that I didn't think that I would like because it's not my kind of book, and I'm not saying that because it's fantasy, but it does have some content that I tend to not enjoy so much. There is a decent amount of language in this book, and I feel like some of the violent scenes were a little more graphic than I might prefer, but there was something about this book that just kept drawing me back, and I really enjoyed the characterization. So I will be continuing on with this series. In fact, I did purchase book 2. The next series that I want to talk about, I actually don't remember the name of the series. The first book is Six Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim. This is a YA fantasy duology that is very heavily rooted in Asian folklore and mythology, and that is what I found so very fun about this book. It did feel on the younger end of YA, and I've had some people tell me that book 2 felt even more young and they didn't like it as much. But for now, I do plan to continue on with this duology. It's only 1 more book, and I'm also kind of like pre-screening it to see if it's something that maybe Claire would enjoy in a couple years. Next up, we have the Stormlight Archives, and I actually vlogged my experience reading Way of Kings, which was super fun, and I'll link that in case you didn't see it, but it was really fun. Really enjoyed this book, and this is an adult fantasy by Brandon Sanderson, and I had read his Mistborn Era 1 series, and then I've also read several of the Skyward books. So I was no stranger to Brandon Sanderson's writing or his fantasy worlds, but I do feel like Stormlight Archive is definitely much more vast of a world and a lot more to explore and a lot more to get into than Mistborn. That being said, I feel like he set up the world so well. And I do have every other book in the Stormlight Archive that's out so far. It is supposed to be a 10-book series, but as of right now, there are 4 books out and I own all of them. So definitely planning to continue on with this one as well. Next up, we have my favorite book of the year, and that's Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is book 1 of the Farseer trilogy, which is overall part of her, is it Enderlings series or whatever? Like, all of her series are interconnected in the same world, but they're individual trilogies that kind of build upon each other. So this is the first book of the first trilogy, and obviously I loved it since it was my first book of the year. And the world is really interesting, and people have different kinds of powers that they kind of get into. And the first book is really a story of this young boy, Fitz, who is basically the bastard son of a prince, and his bringing up and coming into his own and all of that kind of stuff. And it was so, so good. The whole first trilogy is really just following Fitz, I think. And then we kind of deviate, and then I think we come back to him in a later trilogy. So I'm definitely continuing on with the Farseer trilogy. Next up, we have a middle grade mystery series, which I did just recently talk about because it was part of my December wrap up. And that's the Myrtle Hardcastle series, which actually, that book's still right there. I haven't put it away yet. My shelves are kind of messy. That's okay. Anyways, like I said, this is a middle grade mystery set in the Victorian era. The book that I just read in December is book 3, but I read book 1 in January. So I read 3 of the 4 books that are out. I don't know if there are going to be more than 4, but I absolutely love this series. It's really adventurous and fun, but also super funny. Myrtle's very precocious, but not obnoxious or disrespectful to adults around her. And I just felt like there's a really good balance there. And also it's really fun because it takes place in the Victorian time period. And so there are things kids might not know or terms they might not know. And there's a lot of footnotes, and some of them are funny, but some of them are super informative. And so I really liked that. The next book is The School for Good and Evil, which is the first book in a series called The School for Good and Evil. I think there's like 6 books in this series, but I did not like this book, which is so unfortunate because it had so many fairy tale elements to it, and I love fairy tale retellings, and it had a lot of that. It was basically about these 2 girls who go to the School for Good and Evil, where the School for Good trains up people to be the heroes of the story or the princesses in the story, and then the School for Evil trains up, like, you know, the villains and the witches and all of that kind of stuff. And it had a really great potential, but there was just a lot of things that I found really bothersome about it, particularly the depiction of a very toxic friendship kind of being hailed as this amazing friendship, and some weird like sexualizing of 12-year-olds and just things that I'm like, why is this here, and why is this a middle grade book? So I will not be continuing on with this series. Next up, we have the Barsetshire Chronicles by Anthony Trollope. I read The Warden during Victober, and it was my very first Anthony Trollope, and I really loved The Warden. And I think that the Barsetshire Chronicles, I believe there's 5 books, and they're not like this linear series. They all take place in the same area, and I think characters from other books kind of dip in and out, but it's not like each book like truly builds on the one before. I've actually had people tell me you don't necessarily have to start with The Warden, but it is the first book. So I'll be interested to see how the other books in the series play out, because I've never heard anyone say that The Warden was their favorite. And it was not a 5-star book for me, but I have heard some people say the second book is their favorite. I've heard some people say the 3rd book, and I've heard some people say the 5th book. So I feel like I have a lot of really great Trollope to get to. Next up, we have a middle grade fantasy series, the Wings of Fire series. I read book 1, The Dragonette Prophecy, with my daughter, and my daughter loved this book, and she's gone on to read every single book in the series. And I think there's like 13 or 14 books right now. She's read them all, loved them all. But even though I found book 1 to be enjoyable in some ways, I didn't like it enough to continue, and I kind of doubt I will unless my daughter like really talks me into it. Next up, we have the only series that I began and finished in 2022, and that is The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. I feel like I have talked about this on my channel a lot, so I'm not going to rehash it all that much, but it is like a very slow and very politically based fantasy series. So if that's not really the vibe you're looking for, it's also very Asian inspired. I could see this not being for everyone because it's very different than most fantasies I've read. I don't feel like it's this breakneck pace. There are moments within each of the books where it picks up and you're like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? But as a whole, I would not call the series that. I would say it's just very meaningful and you're following these same two characters throughout their entire lives. Like this series spans probably, I don't know, maybe like 50 years or a little longer. So it's very unique in that way as well. So I loved it, and I want to read more Daniel Abraham, even though I did finish the series. Next up, we have another classic, and that is Fellowship of the Ring. I had really hoped to reread all of the Lord of the Rings last year, and it just didn't happen. I read Fellowship of the Ring, and then part of the Two Towers, and part of the problem with this is that we were listening to an audiobook version of this that was a dramatization, which was amazing. It had like music and sound effects from the movies, and then also like different narrators for different characters. And so it was amazing. It was so good. And we listened to the entirety of Fellowship of the Ring when we went on vacation in May. And then we started the Two Towers, and then whoever put out the podcast took all the episodes down and started slowly like re-releasing them one by one. So they may be up again by now. I'm guessing they did that because of the launch of the Ring of Power, the TV show. I'm guessing that that's probably why they did that. But it was really a bummer. So we were hoping on each of our trips, because we had several trips last year, to listen to a different book each time. And it just didn't happen, which was unfortunate. So I did not complete this series, but I am going back to it. I don't know if it'll be in 2023 or not, but I will go back to it. Next up, we have a YA fantasy series, Reckless by Cornelia Funke. This was part of my read-a-read project. It's the first in a trilogy, the Mirror World trilogy. And this actually, kind of like The School for Good and Evil, had really great fairy tale vibes to it, but the execution was not great, unfortunately. And I love Cornelia Funke, so I wish that I worked out differently. I didn't find anything super objectionable about the book, unlike The School for Good and Evil. There are things in that book that I'm like, why? This is not, no, why? And I did not feel that way about Reckless at all. I just felt like there were a lot of plot holes and not great character development. And I wish that that had not been the case. But it was, so I will not be continuing this series. The last middle grade series on this list is The One and Only Ivan. I don't know what the name of the series is, but my daughter and I read this book for school, and we just loved this book. Oh, I loved everything about The One and Only Ivan. It was so amazing. One of my favorite middle grades of the year for sure. But there are more books in the series. This is about a gorilla, by the way, who is part of a circus that's in a strip mall. And so it's kind of following him. He's not really well treated. And then there's a book that comes afterwards called The One and Only Bob, which is about the dog in the book. And then coming out very soon is a book about the baby elephant in The One and Only Ivan called The One and Only Ruby. So there will be 3 books in this series, and I'm looking forward to reading the other 2, and I'm hoping that they're just as wonderful as The One and Only Ivan. The last few series that I want to talk about are all manga series that I started in 2022. So the first one is Spy Family, and I've talked about this one a lot. I really enjoyed Spy Family. I got 5 volumes in the course of the year, and just enjoyed them all so much, and I feel like there's a lot of buzz around it right now, so I'm sure you've probably heard about it because there's an anime series out now as well. It's really heartwarming and adorable and fun and funny, so I'm totally continuing on with this. And actually, spoiler alert for my January wrap-up whenever that comes, but I have already continued with it this year. Next up, we have Fruits Basket, which I read the first volume of this, but I think it was like a super volume that had multiple volumes in it because it was really big. And I don't know if I'm going to continue with this one. It's about this girl who kind of becomes like homeless and needs to camp out in a tent for various reasons. It's not supposed to be a permanent situation. And she ends up moving in with these boys who kind of like rescue her in a way. And she finds out that everyone in their family represents a member of the Chinese zodiac. And anytime that they get hugged, I think, by the opposite gender, they turn into those animals. And so It was charming and it was funny, and I loved the main character, Toru Honda, because she just always sees the good in people, and as a result of her seeing the good in people, she pulls the good things out of them. But as much as I loved her, I don't know, I felt like it was kind of chaotic and confusing at times, and I just am undecided as to whether or not I'm going to continue on with it. Maybe at some point. It's just not a super high priority. I actually had volume 2 of Fruits Basket out from the library for like months and didn't get to it, and finally said, why am I lying to myself? I'm not going to pick this up anytime soon, and I returned it. Then we have this super adorable one about a cat called Cheese Sweet Home. And I read the first volume of this to kind of screen it for my daughter, because the way my library is laid out, because it's so tiny, they have YA and middle grade books together. And so I never know if it's something that is actually going to be appropriate for my daughter unless I know the book or know the author. So I read it first, and it's so cute. I highly recommend if you are a cat lover. I doubt that I will continue on with the series though, unless I just need something like super fluffy as filler, because it's not like it was life-changing or anything, but my daughter really enjoyed it. She read all 4 volumes. And the last manga series and the last series that I'm mentioning period on here is Snow White with the Red Hair. And this is not what I was expecting. I really thought it was going to be a fairy tale retelling, and it's really not that. There's like this element at the beginning, kind of like a poison apple, and like someone saves her, and so she goes off with him, but it's not really like Snow White at all in any other way except for that. And I just found it kind of bland. It wasn't super interesting, and I'm not planning on continuing with it. It was fine. You may enjoy it. I just didn't really get invested in any way or care about the characters or understand why the plot was moving the way that it was. And maybe it requires reading more volumes to get there. I don't know, but it's not one I really care about continuing. Well, there are the 17 series that I started this year. And if I counted correctly, I finished one and will definitely continue with 10 of them probably this year. And then I think I had like 1 or 2 that maybe I'll continue on with, and then several that I just did not enjoy or downright hated. So I guess 2022 was the year of the series. So hopefully 2023 will be the year of continuing series and maybe finishing some of these series, because my track record for reading the first book in a series last year was great, but my track record for continuing series or completing series was not good at all, because I had 1 series on this list that I completed and only 1 other series that I read anything else from that series. So out of 17 series, when I plan to continue with at least 10 of them, is not very good. So I really hope that I am able to continue with more of these. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. What are some series that you have started and enjoyed and that you really hope to continue to make some progress in? Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.